So a little bit about myself. I have been a software developer for about 4 or 5 years now.
Hey Bill, it's hard to hear you back here. Could you tilt that mic a little bit towards you? I adjusted it from my height, and you're considerably taller than me.
Yeah, taller than
so.
Is that better? I've been a software developer for about 4 or 5 years now. I initially started my software development experience. I actually got my degree in mechanical engineering. And I remember sophomore year sitting in class in a C++, intro to C++, and thinking to myself, I am never, ever going to need to do this, ever. And yeah, here we are. I moved to Colorado and met Jesse here, and he basically got me into the whole web design, web app world, and ever since then I fell in love with it and just really haven't looked back. So I started out doing C# stuff. We were I was originally learning on a jQuery UI widget pattern, and so that was kind of my first intro to JavaScript, and then obviously C# Web API on the back end. And when we made the transition to Angular, it was kind of one of those things where all this stuff that I had learned, how much boilerplate there was with C# apps, .NET, and that whole world, and getting into Node and Angular, and the simplicity of having JavaScript not only on the front end but also the back end, it really just it made my development experience so much faster because I wasn't having to constantly switch between languages. So anyways, you can tell I like JavaScript. I've been working with Angular and Node now for about 2 years, something like that. So yeah, basically what I got here, let me see if I can change the view for you guys. Presentation mode. Presentation. Okay. Does anyone remember what the command is for getting my
Command 1.
What is it?
Command 1. Reed would be able to say.
Perfect.
It's true.
He was about to.
All right. So I basically have this. It's a basic Node Express Angular app, and we can go into a little bit of the setup. I apologize. Like I said, I branched this off of my POC, so you'll probably see a couple of extra things in there that we probably don't need, but bear with me. Body parser, yeah, I'm not doing any posts. Don't need body parser. You can see here, this is just basically my app.get root, and I am serving up my Angular index HTML file. So just using handlebars to render that. You can see here in index handlebars, I've got just a basic header, my app. I'm defining the base controller up top, and for the scope of what I'm doing here, I'm just keeping it brutally simple. I'm just using controllers. Going into the world of directives, it just seemed kind of overkill for the point that I'm going to get across in this presentation. So we've got our base controller here, and you can see that is the global controller. That encompasses all of the other controllers that I'm about to talk about. In here, this is my app.js. And you can see I'm just bringing in some Angular modules. Like I said, I don't have any directives in this project, but I've got it included in there. I bring in everything to my top level app here. And this is where I bind up my base controller. So what I'm going to be looking at here is the right and wrong ways to pass data throughout a project. Right now, I am working on I've got a contract at MapQuest, and the problem came up where they wanted to have an ad, right? They love their ads on that kind of stuff, and so they had in their sidebar they had an ad, right? And they wanted to display an ad right in the middle of the map, which I don't know why they wanted to do that. That's just how they do it, I guess. Right in the middle of the map on the other side. So the problem was that the event that fires the call to the service to say, hey, I need you to go get this ad data, that call lived in this search sidebar controller on the side and completely out of the scope of the actual map. And so the goal was to obviously only go and get the ad data one time, and once we have the ad data, notify the map controller that, hey, I've got some new data here and I need you to render a new ad. So we're going to be diving into observables. Basically, it's basically just a callback, right? It's like, hey, this thing happened and now fire this callback. So we'll go over here. I don't have to exit presentation every time, we'll see. So we have here, this is the factory. So the initial problem that we were running into was when we load the data here, I'm going to refresh this. When we load the data, this main factory controller, can you guys see that okay? Okay. How's that? That would be like the search bar that we were dealing with, where it's in this down the scope chain, it's up to the side, and it fires the event, okay? So what happens is it says, hey, I want to go get data, and it goes to its service and says, hey, I'm going to go get my data. So I've represented that here with this button, set data, okay? So you can see, hey, look, it's going and getting the data. All it's doing is generating a random number. And it works great. The problem is, you can see this factory 1 controller has no idea that this has changed. So they're both tied into the same factory, but it doesn't know that anything's changed. So you can see that if I press the get data button, sure enough, it goes and says, hey, I'm going to make a call, and it works now, and I know exactly what it is. But obviously, we can't do that manually. We're software developers. We have to automate this. So I can show you guys just kind of the basic code for what that looks like. And I've got that here in my factory service. So this is just the basic service. It's got two functions on it, change item and get item, and that service is just simply returned. And so you can see that in my home factory controller, it's got a simple, hey, load the data, bind it to the scope, and this is the set data. It goes to the factory service and calls change item. Now, when we go to the factory 1 controller, you can see it's kind of the same thing, okay? Now, it's pretty obvious to you who do this kind of stuff that they obviously aren't listening to it. So what we do here is, in this example, this actually does share data between the parent and child scope. Now, this is an example of the wrong way to do this, okay? You can see when I go and get data, hey, look at that, both controllers pick that up. And what this is the hierarchical structure of controllers, right? If a parent controller does something or updates something, all the children have access to that scope. So basically what I've done here is the base controller, which was the top level controller, it goes to the factory and gets it, and then the parent 1 controller just renders it right there. There's actually nothing that parent 1 controller does. It just listens to its parent controller. So the cool thing about this is that it's really, really easy to do, right? Having a controller is even overkill for the scope of this. What's bad about this is that you lose visibility really quickly about where a variable is coming from. So it's really not a good idea to do this. You're going to incur a lot of technical debt. if you're doing this, but it is a really quick way to just say, hey, I got this thing up here that I need to grab and I need to bring it down here. Boom, there it is. Okay. So moving on, we've got our root scope broadcast. Now, this is one of the most abused things that I see in Angular. It's simple, it's straightforward, and I have worked in apps where I walk into this thing and I am like, I have no idea where this event is coming from. How does this work? It becomes a complete rat's nest of, hey, this event happened over here, and notify it over here, and eventually as your projects get bigger, it just, everything becomes so complicated. So a root scope broadcast, I'll go take a look at this. You can see here, we've got our button click, and we've got our root scope. You can see we injected up at the top here. And it's called data updated. It's called the data update event, okay? And it goes and returns the set data value, and then it passes it along the root scope, which is then picked up in the broadcast one controller. And you can see, there it is right there, rootscope.on, here's the data updated event, and it passes the data. And as you guys saw, it does work, right? You do incur some memory problems if you're abusing the root scope too much. You want to use the root scope when you want to use a root scope broadcast when you want to communicate between two controllers. Like, hey, I've got this thing over here in this controller. This event just happened, and over here in this other controller, I want to know about it. And so you can go back and forth. I mean, that's its intention. Obviously, in Angular 2, this all goes away. They're going to be going more towards observables, but I am not a full expert on exactly what that looks like. So,
so why do you think that this is so hard to follow after you, let's say, walk into this code first? I mean, all you would have to do is actually do a search for data.
Sure. And you're absolutely right. You do search for, the event. Where did this come from? However, it gets messy when there becomes a lot more happening to get to that event. There will be nested events. I've seen nested events, and so it becomes this chain of like, hey, this event happened over here, so then fire this event, and then this event fires this event, and it gets messy. So if you keep it clean, and I would always encourage you to, if you're going to do a root scope broadcast, make it as simple as possible, simple and straightforward, so another developer can walk in and just easily read it.
Just to dovetail on that, you also have ones that are actually broadcasting up and down. I always get this mixed up, whether it's broadcaster or emit. I believe broadcast is broadcasting from the root scope all the way down to the children scope. So if you have scopes that are inheriting from each other, or it doesn't have an isolate scope, I believe what you could actually see is a situation where intermediate level one is actually getting that and swallowing it, and then not allowing it to go down to its child. So even though you're searching and you're like, hey, look, it's supposed to be firing, and nothing's happening. That's why this pattern is bad. And the biggest part is scope is going away in Angular 2.0. So this is practices that you need to get away from. Do they work? Sure. I've used them. I've abused them. Is it really what you want to be doing long term? No. You gotta find other ways to get around it, and that's what Bill's gonna.
And to elaborate on that, with the event firing pattern, the broadcast pattern, it's not so bad when you're broadcasting on the root scope, but as soon as you start broadcasting on just the scope and it broadcasts to its children, when we build single page apps, as soon as you destroy a controller, that event may no longer fire. So you may be relying on that event to fire, and you've actually already destroyed that controller. So now you're figuring out, why is this not happening? Just another thing to be careful of if you're going to be using broadcast. So, now that we've talked about broadcasts, which you can see, that does work. We'll go into what I would consider the more correct way to do this. This is using object-oriented programming at its finest. You're basically passing an object into another object, and they're able to update each other. They're able to have context of each other so that they can interact with each other. So that's what these two are happening. That's what's happening in these two here. So you can see in the visitor pattern, we are updating, and everything works great. So let's take a look at what's happening there. So this is the main controller, the one with the button on it, and it's pretty much identical to exactly what I showed you before. It's got button click, it's got the the change item, and it's got a function to get the item. Okay. Where the magic happens is right here, where we are passing in the visitor data service, and it's got this function here called RegisterContext. And what we're doing is we're passing the context of this, right? Context of this scope, this object prototype, and we're passing it to visitor service. So you can see RegisterContext here. We've got this undefined variable initially when we load this factory. I'm sorry, it's a service. This service, and when the RegisterContext function gets called, it passes that context directly into this variable. So this service is literally holding the context of that controller. So what happens next? Okay, so when we press that change item button, you can see, hey, it generates this random number, and it calls the notify all. And what notify all does is it basically takes the context and allows me to hit my function with it, right? So I've got this my item function that was back over here. This is our one controller. And you can see all this does is it takes the visitor data service get item, and then it sets it to the visitor one item. So I'm just setting it to the scope. It allows me to grab the item from the service and inject it into the scope.
Is that pretty much like kind of spin on isolated scope?
Spin on isolated scope. How do you mean?
Well, I mean, using isolated scopes, you can pass data around with that too. But it just seems like it's real similar to using isolated scopes.
You mean
my item on that scope, and your reference my item on a different scope, and it's real similar, but
well, I mean, when you have an isolated scope, you can pass data into that scope and very explicitly say, hey, I want to pass this object into it. It's a little bit different, but essentially, it is kind of the same thing. You're passing an object into another object. So you can see what we're doing here is, yeah, we're calling the visitor data service get item. So it just executes that function. Like I said, it's observable. It's basically a callback. It's basically a callback that gets executed when we hit this notify all function. It's pretty much as simple as that. And the cool thing about this is that it's nice and clean. You don't have to put a bunch of junk on your root scope. it just says, hey, this controller needs to listen to this service. And instead of broadcasting throughout our entire app, we are using this service as our intermediary point to communicate between two controllers. And that's really awesome because services are singleton, so you just spin it up once and it's just there ready to go. So both controllers are using the same instance. So, moving on to the next one. This is an ObserverListener pattern, and it's very similar to the visitor pattern, as you'll see. It's just a little bit better for binding up large numbers of controllers that need to listen to the same event. So instead of, a lot of people will say, hey, I want to broadcast on the root scope because a lot of controllers need to hear about this. Well, you can do it this way also. So you can see when I set my data, the main hits it and all the numbers change. So what's happening here is we have our HomeListener, exactly the same. I probably could have just used the same controller for every single one of these. There's really no difference here. Here's my listener one, and it's the same concept. You are calling this register data listener, and you're passing in the context of the function. So here's my listener service. So what this does is we've got this empty array of data listeners, and in the register data listener, you just push that object onto the data listeners array. And so you're just building an array, right? If you've got 10 controllers, just build an array of 10. You can see it's got the same notify all. And what happens here is it comes down and it's got a for loop that iterates over all the listeners. So when the change item happens, it just iterates over this for loop, and instead of it being more, it's basically the same thing. It's a callback. You're calling the my item and you're passing it in. And as you can see from the demo, it works. And this is a much cleaner way of broadcasting events. Literally as simple as that. I'm going to get this up on our GitHub repo. I have not pushed it up yet, but if you guys check our website, then you can see where I've published this too, and you can play around with it. It's pretty simple, and it has huge ramifications. It literally, when we implemented the listener pattern for the ads, it became this thing where it was like, it's easy to now, if they want to throw an ad up on some other page somewhere else, it's just, hey, bring in the service and bind it up, and inject the context, and simple as that. And here's your ad data. So moving forward, obviously this is using a lot of controllers, which Angular is getting away from, but there's no reason why any other JavaScript data structure can't do this stuff too. It's just a very fundamental design pattern that you should always, in my opinion, jump to before you jump to a root scope broadcast solution. Do this first and see if you can create that center point at your factory or service or provider before projecting onto the root scope.
Presumably this is in the gang of code. It's been 10+ years since I read that. It's like a really small part. The observer pattern's in there, right? I know it is.
Yeah.
MVC isn't up. Okay. Would this look basically the same, or you haven't looked at it? My follow-up question was, where did you get this from? Did you see the idea of Stack Overflow, or did you read Gang of Four 15 years ago, 20 years ago?
It was a solution that I had arrived at in a previous job that I had worked at. I worked at Penske Trust Company, and I built an Angular app for them. and it was one of those things where I was like, all right, how do we do this? And I will admit, it was my first Angular project, and I was polluting the root scope with broadcast, and I was like, this isn't going to work. And so I just started looking up, what's a better way to do this, and I came across the listener pattern.
The advantage of using the root scope, and I don't know anything about this too much, but is that the broadcast of events is agnostic to who's listening. And it doesn't know who's publishing them, and it doesn't know who's listening to them. And so all the components are completely uncoupled. Whereas with your thing, you got a service that is aware of, I guess the two components that want to communicate have to both have knowledge of and share a service, right?
They do have to share the service, yes. And the service needs to know the context of everything else that's listening. So if you get into more the observer pattern, there's two fundamental ways of doing observers, and one's a push and one's a pull. So what I've described here is the push method, to where it's like, hey, this just happened, let everybody else know that this just happened. The other method, the pull, is more along the lines of like, hey, go and check to see if anything's changed. If something's changed, then go and do whatever you want to do.
I can comment too, this doesn't rely on magic strings, whereas the other one's got magic strings. The number of defects in my career that have been a string, has been the case has been wrong, typo is just ridiculous. The number of times I've seen that. Whereas once you've moved to TypeScript with this, basically if you get it wrong, you're going to tell it compile time you're wrong. So this is just vastly superior from my experience.
Real quick, I want to make a note. One thing that I did not show here is that you should all be in the practice of doing is destroying your listeners after you're done. So whenever you're if you're moving in your single page app and you destroy your controller, you should also destroy the instance of that in the service. You should always be cleaning up, because otherwise you will see memory leaks.
So do you mean you're right up there? I'm kind of a noob to Angular. I've been doing it a while, not very long. Do you mean the data listens? Do you mean the data listens are right, or what do you mean?
So
unregistered data?
yeah, exactly. So what I would do, I might do something like so like on destroy. Destroy, and then I might set this and say data listeners. And then I say like data listeners. Something like that, just to clean them up.
When you do or to get rid of your listener block, you want to go to the very
I'm sorry, one more time.
So he's talking about actually removing the listener from the data listeners array. So like if you have something like a service that then is destroyed, needs to remove itself. So for example, in your register data listener, you could return a function when you call, you could remove the listener. You're exposing a specific function.
And obviously this isn't going to work because services don't have scope. But you get the idea. It's whenever you clean up, you want to set those listeners to null. And I did it beautifully in the project. I did exactly what I did.
So really the only difference between the observer listener and the visitor is the observer listeners are the parties or people.
Exactly. Exactly. Because in the visitor pattern, it's actually simpler. Like if you know you're just going to have one guy show up to the party, it gets. You wouldn't want to have all these variables sitting up here, right? It's just easier to throw them in an array because I mean that's essentially what we're just throwing them in an array. They're almost exactly the same. Any more questions?